So, the Opium Wars. We all kind of think we know that story, right? Britain, all gunboats and greed, forcing a destructive drug on China, leading to a nation's humiliation. But what if I told you that's not where the story really begins? What if the first, and maybe the most important exchange, had nothing to do with opium at all?
All right, let's get into it. The real story, the one that basically sets the stage for everything that followed, actually starts decades earlier. And it doesn't start with a war. It starts with a letter. Just a single letter that would, no exaggeration, change the course of history.
But first things first, let's do a quick recap of the story we're all familiar with. You know, the standard version, China as the victim of aggressive Western imperialism.
So you flash forward to the mid-1800s and bam, conflict just explodes between Britain and China. We're talking two really devastating wars. And you've got Britain, the global superpower of the day, just bringing its full military might down on the Qing dynasty. I mean, it makes you wonder, right? How did things even get to this point?
Well, the answer, tragically, is pretty simple. It was all about the money, specifically opium. See, British merchants were making an absolute fortune selling it. So when the Chinese government, for obvious reasons, tried to ban the drug, these merchants, well, they ran to their government and demanded military backup to protect their business. And they got it. And the results for China, I mean, they were just catastrophic. They lose both wars. They're forced to sign these things that go down in history as the unequal treaties. They have to open up their ports, give up territory. This is where Hong Kong comes into the picture. And to add insult to injury, they had to watch as British and French soldiers just looted and burned the emperor's incredible summer palace. It was a humiliation on a scale that's hard to even imagine.
And you know what? That's usually where the story ends in the history books. But there's this great quote from a historian, Horst J, who says this is just the thesis. To get the full picture, to find the antithesis, we've got to go back, way back.
So, let's rewind the clock. We're jumping back 50 years before the first shots were even fired. Because back then, the relationship between Britain and China, it looked totally different.
Yeah, in 1793, there are no gunboats, no threats of war. Instead, you've got a British ship showing up with diplomats. Their mission? Peace and trade. This is almost a full 50 years before the war, so you have to ask, what in the world happened in that half-century to change everything?
This whole thing was called the Macartney Mission. And really, by all accounts, it was a pretty legitimate, good faith effort. You've got King George III trying to open up formal diplomatic channels with the Emperor of China. The goal was super simple. Let's trade more and let's make the terms a little better for everyone.
So what were the British asking for? Honestly, it was pretty standard stuff for the era. They were like, hey, can we trade in more than just the one city, Canton? Can we set up a permanent embassy in Beijing? How about we use a small island, say Chusan, for our merchants to live on? And could we maybe lower the tariffs a bit? Seems reasonable, right? Well, let's just say the Chinese emperor did not see it that way.
And this is where we get to the absolute heart of the story. The official reply from the Emperor Qianlong back to King George III. I'm not exaggerating when I say this letter is one of the most jaw-dropping documents in the entire history of diplomacy.
Right from the get-go, the tone is just shocking. The emperor starts by talking about the king's respectful spirit of submission. Submission. This is not a conversation between equals. This is a ruler talking down to a subject who's bringing him tribute. And then he just lays it out. We, the Celestial Empire, have everything we could ever need. We don't want or need your stuff.
Oh, but it gets better. He then calls the British barbarian merchants. And look, this wasn't just trash talk. This was a window into a core belief system. The idea that China was the absolute center of the universe, the Celestial Empire, and literally everyone else was just a barbarian.
So, needless to say, the request for an island and more trade ports? Flat out rejected. But it's his reasoning that's so telling. He doesn't just say no. He calls their proposal an evil example and worries that if he says yes to them, all the other barbarians will want the same thing.
And then comes the mic drop. The end of the letter. This is not diplomacy. This is a command. He ends his letter to the king of the most powerful empire on earth with a direct threat and an order. Tremblingly obey and show no negligence. Wow. Back in London, this was seen as an unbelievable insult, a massive provocation. The fuse was officially lit.
Now, to be clear, that letter from 1793 didn't directly cause the Opium Wars. But what it did was expose this massive, unbridgeable gap, a total clash of civilizations that made a future conflict feel almost inevitable. And the fallout from that conflict, well, it would leave scars on China for the next 200 years.
So think about this for a second. What happens when a nation that believes it's the absolute pinnacle of human civilization gets completely, totally humiliated? First by a letter, and then by a crushing military defeat. It doesn't just sting, it triggers a deep national identity crisis.
And you can really see this process happen in 4 stages. First, you get the humiliation. The military defeat just shatters that belief in their own superiority. Second, frustration. The intellectuals start to doubt their own culture, their own traditions. That leads to stage 3, the search. They start looking around desperately for powerful new ideas. And where do they look? To Europe, the very place that beat them. But, and this is the critical part, they were very, very selective about which European ideas they adopted.
See, because their entire experience with the West was defined by threats, by aggression, by disappointment, they naturally gravitated toward Western ideas that were themselves critical of the West. So thinkers like Karl Marx, who wrote scathing critiques of European capitalism and imperialism, that was incredibly appealing. It was like finding a weapon in your enemy's own arsenal that you could use against them.
And look, this wasn't just a one-off thing. This feeling of being humiliated and betrayed just kept happening, cementing this worldview over generations. A perfect example of this comes way later, in 1919, right after World War I.
Okay, so get this. World War I ends. China fought on the winning side. They were allies with the US, Britain, and France. They fully expected that the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, would give them back Chinese territories that Germany had controlled. Makes sense, right? Wrong. Instead, the Western powers turned around and gave those territories to Japan, China's biggest rival. For China, this was the ultimate backstab. It was all the proof they needed that the West simply could not be trusted.
So that brings us all the way back to today. The story of the Opium Wars, when you zoom out, really isn't just about opium, is it? It's a story that kicks off with a letter demanding submission, it's followed by what many in China call the Century of Humiliation, and it creates these deep historical wounds that are absolutely central to understanding modern China's identity. Which leaves us with one last really big question to think about. How much of that 200-year-old history, that exchange of threats and humiliation, is still echoing in the relationship between China and the West right now, today?